Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're talking about feats. This, of course, is an update video to my previous feats tier list, because that was one of the first tier lists I made for Baldur's Gate, and is the most badly in need of an update. Many of the feats have changed in patches since that was recorded, and I also made some pretty serious misevaluations at the time, so I wanted to update this to a more definitive list. Feats are likely the single most important decision that you'll make when building your character. Most builds will get only 2 or 3 total over all 12 levels, so the opportunity cost for picking weaker ones is incredibly high. They're also pretty much the least balanced mechanic in Dungeons & Dragons, and especially in Baldur's Gate 3, so the power level difference between the weakest ones and the strongest ones is incredibly impactful. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Haki Kerim for the 20 Lev donation, How Hard Can It Be 404 for the 50 euros, Scott Myers for the $10, and Helicoptery, Sketchy, and Havoc for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your awesome, generous support. It really means so much to me. Alright, let's talk about feats. Before we start rating, though, let's quickly talk about how we're going to be analyzing these feats. So I'm considering them purely for their mechanical power level. In other words, how impactful is taking this feat on your character's ability to succeed at tasks, get the story outcomes you want, win encounters, and ultimately win the game. In S+ tier, I'm placing feats that fall outside of the normal balance range for Dungeons & Dragons. For whatever reason, these feats are simply more powerful than anything else in the game, and are part of some of the most broken builds that you can create in Baldur's Gate 3. In S tier, I'm placing feats that are extremely powerful mainstays that you're going to be taking very frequently. These will be used frequently by many builds or some of the very most powerful builds, and are going to show up again and again when building characters. In A tier, I'm placing feats that make good alternatives to the S tier feats for specific builds. These are usually more narrow in scope than S tier feats, but just as or possibly more powerful, so you'll take them less frequently. When you do, you'll be very happy to have them. In B tier, I'm placing feats that are usually for specific interesting strategies. These are things that may not be quite as powerful as the feats in higher tiers, but are still very viable and can often create unique or very interesting characters. They also make good feats to pick if you have one left over after getting everything that you need to make your build function. In C tier, I'm placing feats that are very niche. These show up occasionally in very specific builds, and are usually weaker than the alternatives even in those builds, but if you want to do something specific for fun, the C tier feats can sometimes enable that. And then finally, in D tier, these feats are very weak. Either they have limited to no real mechanical effect, or their effects are very easily duplicated by other effects available in the game. Normally, this is the part of the tier list where I would say, if you enjoy using these D tier feats, keep doing that, and that's still true, but what I will say is that the power delta for feats is so high that unless you're a veteran player looking to do something very specific, I would strongly advise you to avoid taking the D tier feats, as they will significantly weaken your character. Alright, let's get into it. We're going to start, appropriately, with the ability score improvement, which it's nice that it's first alphabetically because it's certainly the first feat you have to talk about. It's the standard by which every other feat has to be judged. An ASI lets you increase one of your ability scores by 2 points, or 2 of them by 1 point, up to a maximum of 20. What this means for a character is that you're going to increase your main attribute, which will give you a +1 bonus to rolls made with that attribute. In other words, you're going to get a +1 bonus to pretty much everything that your character is going to do across an entire playthrough. A strength-based character is going to be making mostly strength rolls, so when you increase your strength by 2, you get a +1 to pretty much every die that you roll over the course of a playthrough. A +1 bonus doesn't sound like much, but in practice, it's a lot. This is a +1 bonus that's applied to everything, which can be tens of thousands of die rolls, and this is a game about rolling dice, so succeeding more frequently at rolling dice is very, very important. Almost every build in the game that's built optimally is going to take 2 ability score improvements to hit 20 in their main attribute. There's, of course, some exceptions, but you can basically never go wrong by increasing your main attribute, so an ability score improvement is always going to be the best or amongst the best feats that you can select when you level up. Although a +1 bonus doesn't sound like a hugely impactful bonus, again, it applies to everything, but it's also worth noting that it gets better the better you are at succeeding at those tasks in the first place. Proportionally, it eliminates more failures, and a lot of optimization in Dungeons & Dragons is about eliminating your chance to fail. What I mean by that is that if you are a character who has a 50% chance of succeeding at a task, and you add a +1 bonus to that, that adds a linear 5% increase to your chance of success, because you're adding +1 on a 20-sided die roll. So your 50% chance goes up to 55% chance. This means that 1 in 10 failures that you would have had previously are now successes, so you've reduced your chance of failing by 10%. If you had a 90% chance to succeed and you increase it to 95%, you've turned half of all cases that you would have failed into successes. So these small linear bonuses, the more you get of them and the better you are at a task, the more proportionally impactful they are on your chance of succeeding. And so it's very, very important to stack many of these bonuses, which is why ability score improvements are so good in the first place. In addition to that, you're going to get more damage, a lot of other knock-on effects, like increasing your strength, increases your carry weight and jump distance, increasing your dexterity, increases your armor class and your initiative. Every time you increase an attribute, it's going to increase your saving throws, and so for especially common saves like wisdom, increasing those is very impactful as well. Having higher ability scores just makes your character better in every arena, so you're always going to want to increase those. There are two things in Baldur's Gate 3 that make you less interested in taking ability scores than you would be in tabletop ASIs than you would be in tabletop. The first is the commonality in Baldur's Gate of attribute replacement items, so the elixirs of Hill Giant Strength that replace your strength score, the gloves of dexterities that replace your dexterity score. Some builds will want to use those items instead of boosting their ability scores with ASIs. Now, even those builds may spend ASIs on different attributes and just still use an elixir of Hill Giant Strength, for example. But that does mean that they are less absurdly prevalent than they are in tabletop in Baldur's Gate 3. The other thing is that there are some story events that can increase your stats, and maybe you can skip an ASI if you're using those, but you are very much deliberately skipping them for an ability score improvement. This is going to be the most common feat that you're going to see in build guides, the most common feat that you're going to take in your playthroughs. Almost every character is going to take 2 of them. I will say that my main annoyance with 5th edition is that this is a feat at all. In previous editions of Dungeons & Dragons, increasing your ability scores happened separately. So in like 3rd edition, you got a feat every 3rd level and an ability score improvement every 4th level, and didn't have to waste a feat pick on just a mandatory selection, which in my opinion was much more fun. But the way that 5th edition is structured, this is basically mandatory for every single character, so of course it's going to go into S tier. Next up, Actor. Actor gives you a +1 to your charisma, and gives you expertise in deception and performance. You don't need to be proficient in those skills to gain expertise, so you can effectively learn 2 skills and add double your proficiency bonus to those. Performance is not super important in Baldur's Gate, but deception is a pretty nice skill to have, and with Actor, you sacrifice very little. Adding 1 to your charisma is often equivalent to an ASI, because you can start with 17 charisma and use Actor to bump yourself up to 18, or you can use Ethel's Hair for the extra odd number. So you can effectively get free expertise in 2 skills on charisma-based characters taking Actor, which can make it a pretty reasonable alternative to an ASI. The trick where you don't need to actually know the skills to get expertise can let a bard or something get expertise in every dialogue skill, which can be fun thematically. And the fact that you can still even out your attributes and get a totally reasonable bonus from Actor means that it can be a solid pick for charisma-based characters. I'm going to give it A tier because the bonuses aren't that impactful, but for some builds, they're basically free, so you can use Actor in order to get these skills if you think that there's something you want for your playthrough. The other important thing to know about Actor is that, for whatever reason, the ability score bonus from Actor isn't capped at 20, unlike almost every other feat that increases your ability scores. So you can stack it with some other story-based bonuses to get charisma values over 20, and get really high charisma bonuses. And that could be useful for some optimized builds, but even outside of that circumstance, it's still a totally reasonable feat to take. Next up, Alert. So I'm going to say right off the start, Alert is broken. It's either the best or second best feat in the game, and it's absurdly, ludicrously powerful. It gives you a +5 to your initiative and prevents surprise. And to understand why this is so good, we need to sort of understand two things. One about the game mechanics and one about strategy. First is that initiative bonuses are incredibly important, because going first means that your enemies often won't get a turn. Dungeons & Dragons can be thought of as an exercise in reducing your enemy turns to as close as 0 as possible. You do that by killing them, by locking them down with control effect, by moving your characters out of the way so that their turns are completely wasted running towards you. There's a lot of ways to do this, but one of the easiest ways is to go first and hit them before they hit you. A dead enemy doesn't get to take a turn, and if you go first, they often won't get to go second at all. The second is that Alert is actually from a different game entirely than Baldur's Gate 3. In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, when you roll initiative, you roll a d20 and add your dexterity plus any additional initiative bonuses. That can include the +5 from Alert, and so a character with Alert will go first a decent percentage more of the time than they would without it. In Baldur's Gate 3, initiative is not rolled on a d20, a 20-sided die, it's rolled on a d4, a 4-sided die. So the +5 from Alert is more than the entire range of values that you can possibly randomly roll with initiative. What that means is that because they copied the values for this feat, the numbers for this feat from a different game, unchanged, the numbers are simply too high for Baldur's Gate. And taking Alert means that you are guaranteed to go before the vast majority of enemies in the game. And without Alert, some dangerous enemies that have it are guaranteed to go before your characters. Since winning initiative is so important, and Alert is a 100% chance to win initiative in a lot of encounters, it just breaks the game balance and means that characters that are intended to go before your enemies and kill your enemies before they can act get a massive bonus from taking Alert. Even other characters will always get more turns if they go first, so you always want Alert where possible, or if you don't have it, you need a plan for having initiative scores that are comparable to this feat, using initiative gear or elixirs of vigilance that duplicate the effect. But you can basically never go wrong taking this on an honor mode character, because it's simply balanced for a different game entirely. S+ tier for Alert, it's ridiculously broken. I recommend that, unless you have very specific plans, every honor mode character should strive to get this as their first or at most second feat. Next up, Athlete. Athlete increases your strength or dexterity by 1 point. So similar to Actor, it's half of an ASI, but you can start with an odd number in those attributes and even it out with Athlete to effectively get a full +1 bonus after taking this. Because you can start with 17 strength and then boost it to 18 with Athlete. It's like you started with 16 strength and then gave yourself +2 with an ability score improvement. In addition to that, it also increases your jump distance by 50%. And if you're knocked prone, it only takes 10 feet of movement to stand up instead of the normal half your movement that you have to spend. The bonus for being knocked prone is not that significant. A lot of the time it won't come up at all because some prone effects in the game last for multiple turns and then Athlete doesn't actually trigger on them. And then also having half your movement speed back after you stand up from prone is usually sufficient, plus characters that are taking Athlete are probably going to have good saves against most effects that knock you prone and are unlikely to benefit from that effect. However, 50% increase to your jump distance is really good. Mobility is really, really powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. Again, this game is about taking more turns than your opponents, more relevant turns than your opponents. And if your melee character can't reach melee, you've wasted their turn. So the ability to jump further with a bonus action and then still make an attack means that they're just going to get more real turns over the course of a playthrough than they would have had otherwise. It can also be used to set up lots of interesting tactical options. You can get to high ground with further jump distance where enemies can't reach you. You can use it to get out of enemy movement range so they can't retaliate against you with attacks. Extra mobility is always good, and Athlete is extra mobility at very low opportunity cost because you are still increasing your main attribute in a relevant way. S tier for Athlete. For characters that want this bonus, it's often just a better ASI. Charger. Charger lets you spend your action and bonus action to move 30 feet in a straight line and either attack or shove backwards the first enemy that you encounter along that line. If you attack, it only uses one of your attacks, so you can continue to attack if you have extra attack, and the Charger attack will do 5 extra damage. And if you use shove, it's just going to do a normal shove, like if you had shoved with your bonus action. Now, this seems pretty reasonable on the face of it, because extra movement speed with your bonus action is pretty powerful. We just talked about how good that is with Athlete. And this can sometimes let you get attacks that you wouldn't get otherwise. However, there's a couple real strikes against Charger. The first is that most characters that want to move with their bonus action, so basically with Charger, you're spending your normal action to attack and you're spending the additional bonus action to move. Most characters that want to move with their bonus action can just jump. And an effect like Athlete can let you bonus action jump to the enemy and then still make your attacks normally. So you're not getting that much from Charger that you wouldn't have from another, from just the default game actions that you can take. If you were on a dexterity character, maybe you're a rogue and can bonus action dash, and then you get the same extra 30 feet of movement. So there aren't that many characters that can't just get this extra movement elsewhere. The shove action of Charger, you can just duplicate by dashing and then shoving with your bonus action when you get there, so is almost never going to come up. The weapon attack from Charger can be okay, because if you don't have a way to move 30 feet with your bonus action, then it can be fine. And it is 5 extra damage, which is relevant, but it comes at such a high cost, spending one of your feats on this very narrow ability that only a small subset of builds actually want at all. And it's also, in practice, really hard to use. The width of the charge when you actually use Charger is high enough that you will sometimes just run into your own allies or boxes or pillars and completely waste your charge attack, because the visual for using this effect is pretty deceptive. I think that if you actually take Charger in practice, you're going to whiff more attacks by running into boxes and terrain than you'll gain by the ability to actually use Charger. So I would only take this if you like the flavor and the visual of it. In terms of mechanical impact, it's very, very limited. D tier for Charger. Crossbow Expert. So Crossbow Expert is a pretty mainstay feat in tabletop D&D for characters that are using a pair of hand crossbows or that are using crossbows in general, but doesn't translate as well into Baldur's Gate 3 for a couple reasons. What Crossbow Expert lets you do is make crossbow attacks in melee without suffering disadvantage. Normally, when you make a ranged attack in melee, you have disadvantage on the attack. Crossbow Expert negates that. In Baldur's Gate 3, it also means that when you hit an enemy with the special piercing shot attack from a crossbow, which inflicts gaping wounds, causing them to take 2 extra damage from every attack, it lasts for twice as long. That additional duration on the debuff isn't bad, but a lot of times if you're hitting an enemy with that attack, you intend to kill them with your next volley of attacks anyways, so it's not going to come up that frequently. The reason that Crossbow Expert doesn't translate that well to Baldur's Gate 3 is, well, there's actually a few reasons. Firstly, in Baldur's Gate 3, crossbows are generally pretty weak. There are not that many good crossbows in the game, so two-handed crossbows are significantly outclassed by two-handed bows, and most characters that would be dedicated bow users are going to be using the magical bows instead, because the magical crossbows simply aren't that good. And even the hand crossbows, there are very few powerful options, though there are more hand crossbow characters. The real difference, though, is a mechanical one. In tabletop D&D, to drop your weapon and draw another weapon takes time, And you have to like drop your weapon on the ground in order to draw a melee weapon if you wanted to attack in melee. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can freely swap between your melee and ranged weapon sets. So a character that's using a pair of hand crossbows can also carry a pair of daggers, still attack in melee with those using their dexterity, and do as much or often more damage just with those attacks than with their hand crossbow attacks. So in order to have effective melee attacks with an archer, you just don't need this feat at all. Even if you have other weapons that you want to carry for whatever reason, maybe you have non-finesse melee weapons that you want to carry on your archer, these tend to be high dexterity characters with good armor classes. They often have bonus action disengage from rogue that they can use to step away and still make the attacks without disadvantage, or they can just walk away and suffer one attack of opportunity and then make the attacks with disadvantage. So even in the case where you want Crossbow Expert because you need to make a ranged attack because you don't have a viable melee weapon, very rare already, you can often just accept taking an attack of opportunity, back away, and then shoot your enemy anyways. I have tried using Crossbow Expert, but in practice, the ability to freely switch your weapons just completely negates the effect of this feat, so it's just duplicated by the base mechanics of Baldur's Gate, D tier for Crossbow Expert. Defensive Duellist. So this is one of the feats that I actually underrated pretty badly in my first iteration of this tier list. It's certainly not incredibly powerful. It's not going to be a mainstay of a lot of heavily optimized builds, but it does have a niche where it can be useful. Defensive Duellist lets you, when you're hit by a melee attack, while you're using a finesse weapon, so any weapon that you're going to be using with your dexterity, you can spend your reaction to add your proficiency bonus to your armor class. If you took this at level 4, your proficiency bonus would be +2, so you'd basically have a reaction to add 2 to your armor class whenever attacked in melee. But most of the time you're going to take this later, so it's going to be adding a +3 or +4 bonus for most of the time span that you have this feat. That's basically like getting half of the shield spell for free every turn, because it doesn't cost you a resource to use Defensive Duellist. And if you're a character that's going to be up in melee and trading melee attacks, this can actually prevent a decent amount of damage. There aren't that many characters that are dexterity-based, that want to be trading attacks in melee, and that want to use their reaction on defending themselves, but they do exist, so things like dexterity-based Ancient Paladins can use this, and it's certainly fine on characters like Swashbuckler Rogues, in order to prevent them from taking damage, and you can end up with a fairly well-set-up defensive character with rogue levels and defensive duelist to cause enemies to miss, to reduce any damage that does get through with uncanny dodge and evasion, and that character can actually be pretty hard to take down. The best comparison in terms of how frequently Defensive Duelist is going to prevent attacks from hitting you is with Warding Flare from Light Cleric, you can use to give enemies disadvantage on the attacks. Warding Flare is, on average, about -3.5 on enemy chances to hit you, and Defensive Duelist is going to be either -3 or 4 on enemy chances to hit you with a reaction. So it's going to prevent a similar amount of damage to that effect, and that's one of the best class features in the game. Spending a feat on it is obviously a lot bigger of a cost than spending one level of Light Cleric, but this is okay for a build that is already using finesse weapons and already trading damage in enemies with melee. Definitely not something that I would recommend for most characters, but a fun niche pick for characters that are going to be defending themselves, so we're going to give it B tier. Dual Wielder. This is another feat that I definitely misplaced in my first iteration of the tier list. Dual Wielder lets you wield 2 non-light weapons, one in each hand. So as long as the weapon doesn't have the two-handed property, so not like a great sword or a great axe or something like that, you can have one longsword in each hand, for example. If you're actually using this to make, and when you do, you get a +1 bonus to your armor class to offset the fact that you don't get a shield. If you're actually using this to make weapon attacks, then it's pretty weak. Having 2 long swords is not that different than having 2 short swords in your hand. You get a little bit more damage, but most of the characters that would want to be making these offhand attacks with actual weapons can simply use 2 light weapons, save the feat on Dual Wielder, and get something much better in exchange for that instead, like Alert or an ASI, or even something like Defensive Duellist, which will be better for protecting themselves. Where Dual Wielder does shine, though, is actually on mages who can use 2 staves with Dual Wielder. There's a lot of staves in the game with really, really powerful passive effects for spellcasting, and the ability to use 2 of them at once is incredibly powerful. So a character can use the Spell Sparkler and Markaheshkir, for example, to buff up their spells, and get the very strong benefits of both of those staves at once. You can also use it to use Falar Louv in one hand and a staff in the other hand, because that can also increase your damage, Falar Louv being a long sword, so you normally can't dual wield it. And that's also a very powerful way to buff up spellcasters. So Dual Wielder, if you're looking to use this feat kind of as intended, is not very strong. It simply doesn't improve your damage that much when you're using 2 actual weapons to attack with using this feat. But when you're using the passive benefits of 2 weapons, 1 in each hand, there are some gear setups in the game that make Dual Wielder part of some of the most broken and powerful builds in the game. Things like magic missile wizards, fire sorcerers, and so on are very likely to want to take Dual Wielder in order to use Falar or multiple staves for the extremely powerful effects of those magic items when spellcasting. I'm going to give it A tier because it is a small subset of builds that want this, only very specific wizard and sorcerer builds mostly with specific spells and specific equipment in mind will take Dual Wielder, but when you do, it's going to be an incredibly strong bonus to those characters, so A tier. Dungeon Delver. So Dungeon Delver gives you advantage on perception checks to spot traps and hidden objects, and resistance on damage that you would be taking from traps, so you take half damage. This is probably the feat with the lowest impact of any feat in the game, the least impactful on your playthrough. In fact, the effect of this feat is so small that it did literally nothing up until patch 6, and nobody even noticed for 6 patches that this feat was literally not working, because the impact of it working successfully is so minimal. Even if you wanted this effect, which most parties will happily spot traps or just be able to tank them without using Dungeon Delver, advantage on perception checks is really easy to get in other ways, and not even that impactful when you do have it. And a lot of the times when you're looking for traps, the game telegraphs exactly where they are. So even if it's your first playthrough and you haven't learned where the game has put traps yet, you can guess pretty easily because the game designers and level designers made it very clear what areas are going to be trapped. And taking half damage on a trap is just not that impactful either. Most of the time, a trap can't wipe your whole party unless you do something very weird with your positioning, and the likelihood that Dungeon Delver prevents that is also very low, and since you're out of combat when you hit traps, you can just heal back up. D tier for Dungeon Delver, this feat might as well have no text, and in fact, literally did have no text for most of the lifespan of Baldur's Gate 3. Durable. Durable adds +1 to your constitution, and instead of regaining half of your maximum hit points when you short rest, you regain your full hit points, so you're always going to short rest back to full health. Out of combat healing from short resting is basically free in Baldur's Gate, even if that half of your hit points wasn't enough to get you back to full, which most of the time it'll come close enough. The game just drowns you in health potions, so the effect of Durable giving you extra healing is going to be very minimal across your playthrough. +1 Constitution is obviously good. I've talked about how Actor and Athlete, with the odd bonuses to your stats, can replace an ASI. But it's a much rarer build that would want to take an ASI in Con, because it's not a main stat for any character. So the chances that you started with an odd number with the intention to take Durable and boost your Constitution are much lower than with Athlete or Actor, which increase stats that you're likely to want to boost with an ASI anyways. It's not completely useless. I mean, it's a minor effect, but it does exist, and it's hard for something that increases your attributes to be totally useless, because there are builds that will have odd numbers in Constitution and maybe just want to take durable instead of an ASI in order to even those out, or you took 17, 16, 15 as your starting attributes and then boosted the 17 to an 18 with Ethel's hair. You can kind of fit durable in for free there. And when it's free, it's fine, but it's going to be minimally impactful even in those cases. This is going to be taken very rarely, mostly won't matter when it does, so I'm going to give it C tier, because there are some builds that can use it, but if you forgot that this feat existed, you honestly wouldn't be losing out on much. Elemental Adept. So Elemental Adept, you choose one of the 5 elements, acid, cold, lightning, fire, and thunder, and your spells that deal damage of that type will ignore resistance, so enemies who have resistance to that damage type, you'll still deal full damage to them, and you can't roll 1s on the damage dice of those spells. Can't roll 1s in this case means that it turns every 1 that you roll into a 2, so it's not as much extra damage as like Savage Attacker re-rolling your 1s. Turning all your 1s into a 2 might be like 1 or 2 extra damage on most average rolls with a spell of the appropriate damage type, so it's not going to be hugely impactful, but it is a nice little bonus. The main thing that you're here for with Elemental Adept is ignoring resistances, because if you're a character that specializes in one elemental damage type, and that's a type that enemies have a lot of resistances to, then being able to ignore that is pretty useful. The most common one for this is going to be fire. A fire sorcerer is going to want to cast a lot of fire damage spells, because they'll be spec'd into dealing fire damage and get bonuses with these. And there's a lot of enemies in the game that have fire resistance. If you're spec'd into acid, cold, lightning, or thunder, there's not that many enemies that resist those damage types. Spending a whole feat on ignoring those resistances, which is going to come up in like 1 or 2 encounters across the game, is generally going to be a waste. But since there are a lot of enemies that are resistant to fire, and Fire Sorcerer is a pretty powerful and very common build, you do see Elemental Adept Fire on those builds. Now, there are other ways to ignore fire resistance. The Arsonist's Oil is a weapon coating that your allies can use to strip fire resistance away from enemies, or even with some tricks, turn it into fire vulnerability, dealing extra damage to those enemies. And so obviously that does supersede the effect of fire resistance ignoring a bunch of the time. Spending a whole feat on this effect is very expensive, so you do need to be getting a lot out of it, and of course it only comes up in certain encounters. I tend to be lower, I think, on Elemental Adept than most players. You see this, feat recommended a lot for Fire Sorcerers in particular, and also for Tempest Clerics. I think you should never take it on a Tempest Cleric. But for a Fire Sorcerer, it can be okay. But a lot of the time, if you're in a fight where enemies have fire resistance, you can simply just cast another spell. You both will have taken spells that aren't just fire damage on your sorcerer for precisely this reason, and the game gives you a wealth of scrolls that you can use in those circumstances, so spending a whole feat that could have increased your damage to everything, let you go first, given you broken magical effects like Dual Wielder, on just ignoring fire resistance, I think is generally speaking not going to be ideal. It's still good, don't get me wrong, and especially if you're like a solo character, or you don't have a character that can easily use Arsonist's Oil, or you hate using weapon coatings, Elemental Adept is going to save you a lot of clicks, so it can be pretty nice there. But overall, I think that you should strive to not just build characters that fold if an enemy resists their main damage type. You should have characters that are good enough to just win the fights anyways without having to just muscle through it. So I'm going to give Elemental Adept B tier. It still can come up for Fire Sorcerers in particular, and it's certainly not wrong to take it on those characters, but I think generally speaking, you can get more benefit by taking more powerful feats. And if an enemy is particularly resistant to fire damage, just cast a lightning spell and kill them anyways. Great Weapon Master. Great Weapon Master has 2 effects. The first is a passive that you can turn on and off that gives you a -5 on your chance to hit in exchange for +10 damage on each of your attacks while you're using a weapon in 2 hands. This is a massive boost to your damage, especially when you get it early on in the game. Though, of course, a -5 penalty is a severe penalty to your chance to hit. You'll need to mitigate that -5 penalty with effects that increase your chance to hit, attacking with advantage, either gaining advantage on your attacks or doing stuff like blinding your enemies to make attacks against them have advantage, and by boosting your chances to hit with effects like Bless that directly increase your chance to hit, and also, of course, boosting your strength with ability score improvements or potions, things like that, to make your hits more likely to land. Plus 10 damage on each of your attacks, though, is a massive bonus, and definitely worth accepting the penalty. This will often more than double your damage per attack in the early game, and can significantly increase your damage even on into the late game. A fighter with Great Weapon Master in the end game who's making 3 attacks per action and has Action Surge can just get plus 60 damage per round from Great Weapon Master if they're Action Surging, which can easily result in killing an enemy that you wouldn't have killed otherwise. The second effect of Great Weapon Master is that you get an extra attack with as a bonus action whenever you either kill an enemy or score a critical hit. More attacks, of course, is more good. Doing more damage is exactly why you took this feat, and we're going to have lots of ways to increase our chances to hit, so these attacks will be very effective because they're both more likely to hit thanks to all the ways we're boosting this character, and more damaging because we have Great Weapon Master. On enemies where you really just need to do a little bit of damage, you can also toggle the passive off and not worry about the reduced chance to hit if you don't need the extra 10 damage. So knowing when to turn Great Weapon Master on and off is also an important thing about using this feat. But something to keep in mind, and a general rule of thumb, is that you'll do more average damage by leaving it on in the vast majority of circumstances. So if you forget that you can turn this ability off, you're still going to be right most of the time. It feels risky to have the lower chance to hit, but in practice, you're going to kill enemies faster the majority of the time just by leaving Great Weapon Master on always. Increasing your damage by 10 is good both because it's more average damage per attack, but also because it increases the maximum possible damage that you can do in a single round. And dealing damage is not a goal in and of itself. The goal is killing enemies before they get to take a turn. So increasing your maximum available damage in a round means that you're much more likely to drop an enemy to 0 hit points, preventing them from acting in a single round rather than having to wait multiple rounds. So not only is average damage important, minimum and maximum damage are also very important considerations in Baldur's Gate, and Great Weapon Master improves all of them. Many characters that are using two-handed weapons will take Great Weapon Master. It's one of the major draws to that playstyle. Increasing your damage, getting more attacks is exactly what these characters want. S tier for Great Weapon Master. Heavily Armored. Heavily Armored increases your strength by 1 and gives you proficiency with heavy armor. You need medium armor proficiency in order to take it. Now, of course, this is another half stat feat, so it increases your ability scores by 1 and can replace an ability score improvement. But this one suffers from the fact that characters that want to increase their strength usually have heavy armor proficiency anyways, so you are very unlikely to be taking heavily armored instead of an ability score improvement because the characters that want to boost their strength just already have armor proficiency. There's another couple things that make heavily armored less attractive in Baldur's Gate 3 as well. One is that medium armors in this game are really good, and heavy armors are not that great, so a lot of the time getting heavy armor proficiency doesn't actually change the armor that you're going to be wearing for a character, because for much of the game, the medium armor suits are just better, and even in the end game, there aren't that many heavy armor suits that you're super interested in wearing, especially on characters that don't naturally have heavy armor. The most likely time that you would be taking this would be on a spellcaster who has medium armor proficiency. Maybe you want to give them heavy armor. And a lot of the time, those characters can get it from a 1-level dipping cleric, still getting their caster level, getting all of the awesome things that a 1-level dipping cleric gives you, and also getting heavy armor proficiency while sacrificing very, very little. So there just aren't that many characters that are interested in taking this feat because you need to both have medium armor proficiency cuts down the range pretty significantly. Want heavy armor, which is not that common for characters that have medium armor proficiency. And not be able to get heavy armor more efficiently by taking a 1-level dip into a class like Fighter or Cleric, which will give you that armor proficiency anyways. I'll give it C tier because, as with Durable, anything that increases your stats by 1 has some potential to do stuff. Like, you could put it on a Druid. You do keep the attribute point in Wild Shape, so the extra strength can help, and Druids might want heavy armor, but honestly, if you're doing that, just take a level of Cleric instead. You'll still get the caster levels and heavy armor proficiency and way more besides. But I think C tier is fair because it's not completely useless, just very, very rare that it's better than any of the extremely numerous alternatives to taking this feat. Heavy Armor Master. Now this is the heavy armor feat that we're looking for. Heavy Armor Master requires that you already have heavy armor proficiency, but it also increases your strength by 1, and reduces all incoming bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage by 3 while you're wearing heavy armor. A character that's in heavy armor wants this damage reduction. One of the big draws to heavy armor in Baldur's Gate 3 is that a lot of it comes with inherent damage reduction. And damage reduction not only is pretty powerful, it also stacks really well with itself. A character who has 2 damage reduction on their armor suit and takes Heavy Armor Master is taking 5 less damage from many enemy attacks. And a lot of enemies do, 10 or so damage per attack, so you're just taking half damage on every attack. If you combine that with resistances, damage reduction applies after resistance. So if you have resistance to slashing damage, an enemy hits you with 20 slashing damage, you have that to 10, then reduce it by 5, because of the 3 from Ham and then 2 from your armor suit, with just naturally having it. You've only taken 5 damage from 20 incoming damage, so it increases your effective hit points dramatically on characters that are in heavy armor, so they want to be taking attacks from enemies to reduce that damage. They've got high hit points. They often are going to have damage resistances as well, so it all synergizes very well. Because it gives you a point of strength, it will often come at very low opportunity cost. You can take it instead of increasing your strength with an ability score improvement. And so a lot of characters that would want an ability score improvement can take Heavy Armor Master or Athlete or something like that instead in order to boost their strength and also get these quite significant benefits. I'm going to give it A tier because not every heavy armor user is going to want this. There's lots that don't really want to increase their strength or are going to be using strength potions. And in general, I think that you should take Athlete before taking Heavy Armor Master for most characters that want one or the other. But it's very close, and there are some builds that will definitely prefer Heavy Armor Master, especially if you're doing a bunch of damage reduction stuff. Works really well with Armor of Agathis builds and Abjuration Wizard builds and things like that instead, who will be taking Heavy Armor Master very highly. Great feat that you should definitely consider. Lightly Armored. So this increases your strength or dexterity by 1 and gives you proficiency with light armor. So again, it's a half feat, so it increases one of your ability scores. But unlike a lot of the other half feats, this has no additional bonus, and you're basically just sacrificing 1 ability score for nothing. There's almost no character without light armor proficiency that wants it. And if they do, a lot of races in Baldur's Gate just have inherent light armor proficiency, so you're very likely to have it from your race anyways. Robes in this game are way better than the light armor sets, which on the whole are very weak, and most characters that don't come with light armor proficiency have no use for increasing it, and if they don't come with light armor proficiency, they're also very unlikely to want to boost their strength or dexterity at all. D tier for lightly armored, there's just no builds that actually want this feat. Lucky. Lucky gives you 3 luck points, which recharge every long rest, so you can use it 3 times per day, and they can be used to gain advantage on an attack roll, skill check, or saving throw, or to make an enemy reroll their attack. Now, unfortunately, the way that it works when you're gaining advantage on your own stuff is you have to toggle on a passive before making the roll. So you need to choose whether you gain advantage before you roll the die. You don't get to see the result and then re-roll it if you failed. What that means is that you're usually not going to want to use Lucky proactively, except in on rolls that are really, really important and that you have no other way to gain advantage on, because a lot of the time you're going to be likely to succeed on important rolls anyways, and you have a lot of other ways to gain advantage on certain rolls in the game, the ones that are going to be the most important. But lucky can come up for certain specific story events or very specific rolls that you need to make that are really important. So it's okay proactively, but mostly is going to be used defensively. Defensively, it's pretty good. 3 times per day, causing an enemy to re-roll an attack roll that hit you is not bad. That's going to prevent a decent amount of damage and can prevent like critical hits and things like that relatively easily. So it's pretty good for keeping your party alive in that case. And since it can be used on any enemy attack roll, it can also be used to keep your party members alive, not just the character who has lucky. That said, spending a whole feat on this effect is very, very expensive, and only getting it to use 3 times per long rest will means that its effectiveness is going to depend on how often you rest. If you're a player who rests really frequently and you're doing like 1 encounter per long rest, having 3 rerolls per encounter is super strong. If you're a player who rests much more infrequently and you have like 1 reroll every 3rd encounter because you're doing whole big chunks of an act without resting, then lucky is going to be much less impactful. I think that most players probably fall somewhere in between, where they tend to do a few encounters per long rest, in which case you're maybe getting 1 reroll per encounter from lucky, which makes it okay. I'm going to give it B tier because it has enough going for it that it can be good if you don't have other ways to get advantage on important rolls, if you need your party to stay alive, if you rest frequently and thus are getting a lot of rolls out of this. It increases the consistency of your party quite a bit just to have these rerolls and advantage available on everything. It also works on some things that are very hard to get advantage on otherwise without this effect. So things like the mirror you can use lucky on. So there are definitely some use cases for it, but it's very expensive, and usually you're going to be better off with something else. Lucky is more of a like 3rd or 4th feat after you've already gotten the stuff that you really want for a build, or if you're a build that's using like strength elixirs and thus doesn't need ASIs, you might be able to squeeze lucky in there. So kind of a nice to have more than a main strategy. Mage Slayer. So Mage Slayer is kind of similar to Lucky in that it makes a pretty nice 3rd or 4th feat after you've already gotten everything else that you want, but is generally not going to be a mainstay strategy. How it works is that when you're within melee range of an enemy and they cast a spell, you have advantage on saving throws against that spell, so they're not likely to be able to lock you down and then run away. And you get to make a reaction-based opportunity attack when they cast a spell next to you. So you can spend your reaction to opportunity attack them if they cast a spell. Also, if you hit an enemy and they're concentrating on a spell, they have disadvantage on the concentration saves that they have to make to maintain concentration. So it's a couple small bonuses against spellcasters. However, when you have a melee-focused character, like one who would want to take Mage Slayer, in melee range of an enemy spellcaster, you're already pretty happy, so it's kind of a win more feat, because in order for Mage Slayer to do anything, something good already has to be happening in the combat. You've gotten your melee character on top of the enemy spellcaster. This isn't true for every spellcaster. There are some enemies, of course, that are both powerful melee combatants and powerful spellcasters. So in some boss fights, Mage Slayer can have a lot more utility. But against enemy squishy mages, it's often going to be enough just to get your character there and start attacking them. You don't need other bonuses on top of that. What that means is that Mage Slayer is kind of a win more feat and kind of a nice to have. It's going to be pretty good in fights that you're already ahead in, and not do much in fights that you're already behind in, but it does help you lock down fights where things are going well. So you can't run into, or it makes it much harder to run into a situation where you jump in enemy wizard and then they hold person your entire party, because you're going to get the opportunity attack, you're going to shrug off the hold person more easily, you're going to disrupt their concentration with Mage Slayer. This can be pretty good in some encounters, but is generally pretty narrow. I'm going to give it also B tier like Lucky, because I do think that it comes up occasionally, and it is similarly a nice to have feat if you have already gotten the things that your build really needs to function, then Mage Slayer can have some uses, but definitely not one that you're going to take as a high priority. Magic Initiate. So I'm going to say right now that where Magic Initiate is going on this tier list kind of annoys me, because this is a bad feat, but that is saved by the existence of one broken spell that was added in patch 8. Magic Initiate lets you choose a spellcasting class, so Bard, Cleric, Druid, Sorcerer, or Wizard, and learn 2 cantrips and 1 first-level spell from that class. You can cast the cantrips at will, because they're cantrips, and the first-level spell only once per day, so most of the time the first-level spell is not going to be super impactful. The cantrips, generally speaking, most characters don't want to spend their feat on learning just 2 cantrips. Obviously, if you really wanted them, you're often better off just taking 1 level in that class in order to get those cantrips, access to all of their first level spells, or many of them, and the ability to cast them with your normal spell slots, and way more besides from other classes. 1 level of Cleric gets you a bunch of proficiencies, gets you way more spell access than Magic Initiate, and so on. However, there are a couple cantrips that are worth considering picking up from Magic Initiate because they're just that powerful. The first is Eldritch Blast, which used to be the main usage for picking Magic Initiate, was getting Eldritch Blast from Magic Initiate Warlock. But if you want that Spell Sniper, the feat, does that better because it also increases your chance to critically hit, and the extra cantrip and first level spell from Magic Initiate Warlock were not that strong. Until patch 8. Patch 8 added Booming Blade, which is a truly broken cantrip, and there are characters that want Booming Blade badly enough, because it just adds an enormous amount of extra damage to every one of your attacks, that taking Magic Initiate for Booming Blade, specifically, is worth spending even the staggering and monumental cost of a feat. Now, of course, you can get this by being an elf, high elf or high half elf, and spend your wizard cantrip on Booming Blade, but not every character is an elf. And you can get this with a 1 level dip in Sorcerer, Wizard, or Warlock and get Booming Blade from that, and that, of course, is a great way to do it as well, and is usually going to be more common than taking Magic Initiate. But Booming Blade is so good that even some builds that don't want to take Hexblade, a 1 level dip in Hexblade, don't want to take a 1 level dip for Booming Blade, aren't an elf, but are just making a lot of melee attacks, can increase their damage output more by taking Magic Initiate for Booming Blade than by taking any other feat. It's silly because the spell simply shouldn't be that broken, but it is. So getting access to it from Magic Initiate is actually totally fine for some builds. I'm going to give it B tier because most of the time you're still going to be better off taking a 1 level dip into the class instead of taking Magic Initiate. But because of Booming Blade, and basically Booming Blade alone, Magic Initiate is still worth considering for some melee characters. Next up, Martial Adept. Martial Adept lets you learn 2 Battle Master maneuvers and gives you 1 superiority die. So you can learn things like tripping attack or pushing attack and use 1 of those maneuvers per short rest. 1 Battle Master maneuver at the minimum possible strength with the lowest superiority die per short rest is a truly terrible return on a feat. So most martial characters are not going to want to take Martial Adept, and if they did want those special attacks, you're better off, like once per short rest, you're better off just carrying a bunch of weapons that have good short rest weapon actions, and using those rather than wasting a feat on taking this very, very minor bonus. So for most characters, Martial Adept is useless. However, there is one corner case usage for Martial Adept, and that's on a Battle Master fighter themselves. On a Battle Master fighter, this is just 1 extra superiority die per short rest, which can let you use more maneuvers in a given encounter. That's what this character is already spec'd to do, and you'll have bigger superiority dice and be better at using them. So Martial Adept is okay on a Battle Master fighter. Now, I still don't think this is going to be a go-to pick on a Battle Master. Battle Masters are going to do better with effects like Athlete or Great Weapon Master or just ASIs that make them better at the things that they're trying to do. But Martial Adept is an okay pick on a Battle Master fighter specifically. So for that narrow and less than perfectly optimal use case, I'm going to give it C tier. Nobody other than a Battle Master should consider this, but for them it can be fine, though still not as good as most other options. Medium Armor Master. Medium Armor Master removes disadvantage on stealth checks from medium armor, and lets the maximum bonus that you can apply from your dexterity be +3 instead of +2. Now, high dexterity characters in medium armor will already be using the medium armors with uncapped dexterity bonuses that exist in Baldur's Gate 3. So most characters are not going to be getting additional armor class from Medium Armor Master. And even if they were, a feat for just +1 AC is a really bad trade overall. The removal of disadvantage on stealth checks also pretty much doesn't matter. A lot of the medium armors that a stealth character would be using already have that property inherently, and most of the time in Baldur's Gate, stealth characters aren't actually rolling stealth checks, they're just staying outside of enemy vision cones. So Medium Armor Master basically doesn't do anything. But it's even worse than that because, as I mentioned, there are in Baldur's Gate the uncapped medium armors that let you apply your full dexterity bonus, and medium armor's cap overwrites that. So it turns the uncapped bonus to a +3, reducing armor class on high dex characters that would want this feat. So it's actually even worse than that. The fact that it just overwrites the cap, to my younger viewers, that might sound like cap, but I'm being serious here, is just ridiculous and honestly a bug that they should remove from the game, that I'm surprised that it is still in the game. But since it is, Medium Armor Master is both mostly useless and in cases where you might want it, actively detrimental. D tier. Mobile. Mobile is another in the category of nice to have once you've gotten your core feats online, similar to like Mage Slayer and Lucky, but I think overall a little better than those because the bonus from Mobile is generally speaking more powerful than the bonuses from those. You get +10 to your movement speed, which is just really good by default. Increasing your movement speed is really strong in Baldur's Gate. We've talked extensively about how good mobility is already with various feats, and this is just a no questions asked +10 that stacks with other sources of increased movement speed. You also ignore difficult terrain when you are dashing, which if you're dashing, you definitely want to move a long way, so ignoring difficult terrain is sometimes important. Doesn't come up that often, but does come up sometimes. And if you make a melee attack and then move, you will ignore the opportunity attack from that enemy, and that's whether your melee attack hits or misses. That can be useful again for characters like rogues to like dance in and out of combat. That's who's most likely to be taking this feat. So while I don't recommend taking mobile as one of your early feats because it doesn't increase your stats and your raw combat power is generally more important than the bonuses that this gives you, it does open up a lot of late game tactical options, and I think is very often going to be the fourth feat taken on like monoclass rogue characters. It's a pretty good fourth feat on fighters as well. And there are other builds that can make use of mobile for pretty nice bonuses also. I'm a little torn, honestly, on whether to give it A or B tier, because I think it is very much in the fourth feat category, like Lucky and Mage Slayer, but I think it is better enough than those that it's more likely to actually be that fourth feat, so I think I will give it A tier, though it's a little bit in between these two tiers. Moderately armored. So we've seen that lightly armored and heavily armored scored very poorly, but moderately armored is different in several important ways, even though it's part of the same sort of chain of feats. Moderately armored requires light armor proficiency and gives you medium armor proficiency, but it also gives you shield proficiency, so you add 2 proficiencies that your character might not have. Medium armors are way better than the other armor categories in Baldur's Gate, so getting access to the really powerful medium armors is nice. And because this lets you increase either your strength or your dexterity, you can often use it in place of an ASI for a dexterity-based character, in order to get medium armor. So a rogue, especially like a swashbuckler rogue, can start with an odd number in their dexterity, take moderately armored, and have really good medium armor, a shield, which can be very useful at various stages in the game. Maybe you're going to use 2 hand crossbows and then have a shield to passively increase your armor class. And that can make this character much tankier, much harder to take down with very little sacrifice because you're still increasing your dexterity. Obviously, it's a pretty narrow subset of characters that actually want moderately armored, but for a monoclass rogue or a character that's mostly dexterity based that only gets light armor by default, moderately armored is actually a pretty powerful choice that can make your character significantly stronger at very low cost. I'm going to give it A tier because obviously it's going to be less frequently taken than these others, but when it is, it's going to be very, very good. Performer. Performer gives you +1 charisma and proficiency with musical instruments. You can gain musical instrument proficiency through story events if you want that. It also doesn't actually really do anything in game. It's much more of a flavor thing. You can use it to distract characters while you steal stuff, but musical instrument proficiency is generally not mechanical. If you wanted Performer for the +1 charisma, Actor is pretty much always a better choice. So unfortunately, it's D tier. I love this feat. I wish it was better, and I wish musical instrument proficiency mattered more in Baldur's Gate. But since it doesn't, there's just no reason to take this over an ASI or Actor. Polearm Master. So I'm going to admit to a little bit of bias when talking about Polearm Master, because this is one of my very favorite feats in the game. Polearm Master gives you the ability to, when you're using a glaive, halberd, pike, quarterstaff, or spear, though weirdly not a trident, even though in Baldur's Gate 3 a 3-pointed pitchfork is a type of spear and not a trident. Polearm Master doesn't work with tridents. You can use a bonus action to get an extra attack with the butt of your weapon, which does a base d4 of damage. And then also, when an enemy enters your range, you can make an opportunity attack against them. So while you're wielding a polearm, you get a slightly lower damaging but bonus action extra attack, and you're very likely to get an extra attack on once per round on your opponent's turns when they enter your reach. Remember, of course, that you're using a polearm, so you're likely to have a weapon that has greater than the normal 5-foot reach. Your melee range will be longer, and you can make this attack when they enter your increased melee range. This is important for a couple reasons. One, more attacks on your turn is good. The bonus action attack from Polearm Master, of course, is just very powerful. And it can apply a lot of on-hit bonuses and stuff like that. So even though it has slightly lower base damage, it still is going to do a lot of extra damage. Because anytime you can attack, it's going to add a lot of bonuses that your character has accrued. More attacks on your opponent's turns is good for a lot of reasons, because more attacks is good, as we've talked about already, but also because it happens on your opponent's turn, it can often interrupt their turn by killing them, or with the combo of Polearm Master and Sentinel. It's hard to talk about these two feats not together, because they're often part of a combo. Sentinel, when you make an opportunity attack against an enemy, they stop moving. They lose the rest of their movement. So Polearm Master, the enemy approaches you, gets 10 feet away from you with the increased reach of your weapon. You hit them with the Polearm Master attack, stop them moving with the Sentinel feat, and then they're just stuck outside of range of you, unable to attack. On your turn, you back up, they move forwards, and the same thing happens over and over again. So you can keep melee enemies locked down indefinitely with this combo. Even without the combo, it's still a pretty powerful feat. Polearm Master just gives you a lot of extra attacks and a lot of ability to act even when it's not your turn. And the more attacks that you can squeeze out of an attacking character, the better. So any character that's going to be extensively using polearms is likely to want this feat. A tier, it's the basis of a lot of builds, and it's a very powerful effect, because more attacks, it's good. Next up, Resilient. Resilient lets you increase one of your attributes by 1, any of the attributes, and you gain proficiency in the saving throw associated with that attribute. So if you take Resilient for dexterity, you gain +1 dexterity, and you gain proficiency in dex saving throws. This can be pretty useful if you're missing an important save, and don't mind spending one of your feats increasing that associated attribute. Most often, this is going to come up for spellcasters who want to have Constitution save proficiency, so they can concentrate on spells better and not fail their concentration saves. So Resilient for Constitution is a fairly common pick on spellcasters. You can also use it to shore up your saving throws on multi-class spellcasters. For example, if you're a cleric who has one level of sorcerer as your first level, that gets you Constitution saves, but now you don't have Wisdom saves. You can take Resilient for Wisdom and 17 starting Wisdom to still increase your Wisdom and gain an important saving throw back, even though you multiclassed. So Resilient can really shore up your defenses on characters that are multiclassed or characters that need to concentrate on spells more easily. The obvious comparison here, since it's mostly going to be used for concentration, is with Warcaster. Resilient gives you, for most of the game, a +3 bonus, and then in the end game, a +4 bonus on your concentration saves. Warcaster gives you advantage, which is somewhere between 3.5 and 4 on average, depending on how good you are at concentration saves already, and how difficult the roll you're making is. In practice, there's a lot of ways in the game to gain advantage on Constitution saves, so if you don't have con save proficiency, and you want to take one of these two defensive feats that helps you pass your concentration saves, Resilient, I think, is going to be a little bit better. And if you already have Constitution save proficiency, then obviously Resilient doesn't help and you should take Warcaster instead. Now, that being said, both of these are purely defensive effects, and generally it's better to be proactive than to take purely defensive effects. And a lot of characters that would want Resilient for Constitution don't want to spend a feat on it because they have offensive feats that they would rather take. Things like Alert, Dual Wielder, and of course ASIs to increase their main casting stat. And you won't have to make concentration saves that often on those characters if the spells that they're casting are locking down enemies and preventing them from attacking, or of course if you're just killing enemies before they go. I will say that I personally am a lot lower on these purely defensive concentration enabling feats than I think most players are. You see these mentioned as really top tier feat picks frequently, but I find that as you become more experienced with the game, as your builds are stronger, you're just not going to be rolling concentration saves that often on your spellcasters. If you find that you are rolling them frequently, then these can be really powerful defensive tools for making sure that you don't drop your concentration saves. So these are nice safety picks, especially for players who are a little bit newer to the game. I'm going to give Resilient A tier because in its best cases, it's basically free. The aforementioned cleric with an initial level of sorcerer, like I talked about, increasing your 17 wisdom to 18 wisdom is basically the same as taking an ASI and gets you wisdom save proficiency for free. So Resilient is really good in those cases and can still be a pretty solid pick if you just need some help with saving throws on any spellcaster that doesn't naturally have con save proficiency. For non-spellcasting characters, I usually would not consider this feat. You're either any attribute that you want to increase, you'll already have save proficiency in that attribute, so it will usually be wasted. Ritual Caster. Ritual Caster lets you choose and learn 2 ritual spells, which can be cast for free outside of combat. The spells you can choose from are Enhance Sleep, Disguise Self, Find Familiar, Longstrider, Speak with Animals, and Speak with Dead. Most of these can either be gotten for free through items. Speak with Animals, there's a potion that will give you more than enough copies of Speak with Animals for the entire game. Speak with Dead, there's an amulet, and so on. And the ones that you might be interested in, the powerful spells like Enhanced Sleep and Longstrider, are level 1 spells that are available to a lot of classes, and so you're very likely to have these in your party already. Even if you don't, it's probably better just to take a 1-level dip in a class that has access to these, and you'll get way more besides, in addition to these ritual spells. So Ritual Caster, it's just too little value for spending a feat on. I mean, a couple level 1 spells for a whole feat is just not a great trade. D tier for Ritual Caster. Savage Attacker. So Savage Attacker means that when you make a melee attack, you roll your damage dice twice and use the higher result. So this is really good on characters that are making, obviously, melee attacks, it only works for them, and rolling a lot of dice, because it effectively gives you advantage on your damage rolls, increasing your average damage significantly. The exact amount of damage that you're going to increase is going to depend on the size of dice that you're rolling and the number of dice that you're rolling, but for most characters, it's roughly between a 25 and 30% increase to their average damage. Though, like we talked about with Great Weapon Master, it doesn't increase your minimum or maximum damage, so it's an increase to your average, makes your damage more reliable, but isn't going to let you kill enemies that you couldn't have killed previously. 25 to 30% increase to your damage is enormous, and it's especially good for characters that are rolling a lot of dice and applying that 25 to 30% boost to a lot of damage. So characters like Shadowblade users that are rolling a lot of dice, characters that are using smites, characters that are using sneak attacks, and add a lot of dice to their damage. Savage Attacker applies to all of those and is going to increase that damage enormously. On a paladin using a smite attack, and maybe they're using a spell to smite in one of the smite spells in addition to a divine smite, plus stacking extra damage modifiers on their weapons, like for example the Helldust gloves that let you roll an extra d6 of fire damage on every attack. This can be a huge amount of damage and can increase your average damage per turn by 20 or more on characters like that. On characters that aren't adding a lot of dice, Savage Attacker is a lot weaker. If you're mostly a Great Weapon Master character, applying mostly flat bonuses that don't roll dice, and if you're a character that is using your weapon attacks to apply status effects rather than to do big chunks of damage, or if you roll just like one big burst of damage with flat damage bonuses, like a barbarian, Savage Attacker may not be as big a damage increase. But for any character rolling a lot of dice, Savage Attacker is going to increase your average damage per attack dramatically. Now, I'm going to try something a little bit dangerous here and apply some nuance, which I know is always risky on the internet. Savage Attacker is both incredible and a little bit overrated by the community. The amount of damage that you get from this is excellent, and I'm not going to say that this is not a great feat, but I do see it taken on characters that don't benefit very heavily from it. You need to look at how many dice you're rolling per attack, multiply that by 1.25 or 1.3, look at the average damage that you increase with Savage Attacker, and that will tell you how much you're getting from taking Savage Attacker. A character rolling only 2 or 3 dice every attack is not going to benefit from this, but a character rolling lots of dice will benefit tremendously. For rogues, for paladins, for any characters that are adding a lot of damage modifiers, Savage Attacker is going to be your best way to increase your damage. And so, of course, for those characters, it is going into S tier. But I will say that I do see this feat taken on characters that don't benefit from it somewhat frequently, so you should check whether it's the right feat for you. Sentinel. Sentinel is the other half of the Polearm Master Sentinel combo, so we've already talked about it a little bit, but it's also just a great feat in its own right. How it works is when an enemy in melee range of you attacks an ally, you can use your reaction to attack that character, as long as the ally doesn't also have Sentinel. This is to prevent like infinite loops of you both attacking. Secondly, when you hit a creature with an opportunity attack, they stop moving for the turn, so a character trying to move away from you is going to be stuck in place and unable to escape. Finally, you gain advantage on all opportunity attacks that you make, which of course means that these attacks are going to hit much more reliably, both the ones that help you protect your ally and the ones for enemies trying to escape, as well as reaction attacks with things like Polearm Master. The obvious combo here is to attack an enemy before they can fully enter melee range with Polearm Master, like we talked about, which will stop them moving in their tracks and prevent them from taking their attacks, especially for melee enemies. This used to be kind of buggy, so I rated it a little bit lower in my previous tier list. They've cleaned up a lot of the bugs, though you will still sometimes see enemies avoiding this effect. So you do have to be aware that it's not 100% reliable, thanks to some bugs in Baldur's Gate, but still a very powerful combo. Anything that can just stop enemy turns from progressing at all is going to be incredibly strong. And Sentinel just gives you way more attacks, because when an ally gets attacked, you get to attack. When an enemy leaves, they can't leave, and then you get to attack them again on your next turn. So it's just going to give you a lot of control over the battlefield, a lot of agency with your more disruptive characters who can get on squishy enemies and prevent them from leaving. And of course, it's part of a lot of really powerful builds and a lot of really fun combos. Some other fun uses with Sentinel are on things like rogues, who can use it to get off-turn attacks and apply sneak attack on the enemy turn as well. And that will give you extra upfront damage with rogues. You can check out some of my rogue build guides for a little more on how that combo works. So you don't just have to take this with Polearm Master, even though that's the normal way to pick it, but Sentinel, just a very solid feat. I'm going to give it A tier because it's both part of and foundational to a bunch of really powerful builds, and also is just a very solid feat on its own. Next up, Sharpshooter. Sharpshooter is the ranged equivalent of Great Weapon Master, allowing you to take a -5 on your chance to hit with a bow in exchange for +10 damage per attack. You also ignore the high ground penalty with your ranged weapons, so you can shoot up at enemies on cliffs without taking the normal penalty. There's a couple reasons that the toggleable passive on Sharpshooter is better than the one on Great Weapon Master, which is already an incredible effect. One, you're more likely to be able to attack with a ranged weapon because it's ranged, so you are much less likely with those characters to not be able to attack on a given turn. So you're just going to get to use the ability more often. Second, there's easier ways to gain advantage and other bonuses to hit with your ranged weapons. High ground rules in reverse let you gain bonuses shooting down at enemies on low ground, and that can offset the penalty. It's much easier to make attacks from hiding when you are a ranged character, and the advantage can offset the penalty. And the archery fighting style exists, which gives characters using a bow just a flat +2 to their chance to hit, which goes a really long way towards offsetting the Sharpshooter penalty as well. All of these together mean that even though Sharpshooter doesn't give you the extra attacks that Great Weapon Master does, it's, if anything, even more powerful. The ridiculous amount of extra damage that you get with +10 damage from Sharpshooter will add up tremendously. It also can be applied with offhand attacks, with a pair of hand crossbows for even more damage. There's a lot of ways to make lots of attacks with ranged characters, so things like Gloomstalker Rangers get extra attacks. The Sword Bards, of course, can get extra attacks, all of which can benefit from Sharpshooter as well. It's easier to mitigate the penalties. The upsides are just as high, so Sharpshooter, of course, is also going to be S tier, just like Great Weapon Master. Any ranged character is going to take this, just like any two-handed melee character is going to take GWM. Shield Master. Shield Master gives you a +2 bonus to your dexterity saving throw while you're using a shield. And if a spell makes you make a dexterity saving throw, you can use your reaction to basically get the rogue's evasion feature. If you pass the save, you take no damage from that spell, and if you fail the save, you only take half damage instead of the full effect. Except that the feat is bugged, and on a failed save, you're still going to take full damage, even though it's supposed to reduce that damage to half. Currently, if you fail the save against a dexterity-based spell, that feature is bugged and does nothing, and you'll still take full damage from Shield Master. The bug is a real bummer for this feat, which would otherwise, I think, have a place for low dexterity characters that are in a lot of armor, things like paladins, that might want something like this to give themselves a boost to their dexterity saving throws. However, there's a couple reasons that Shield Master is generally not going to be that great, even if it did work. One is that Resilient for Dexterity exists, so if you want a bonus to your dex saves, that's going to give you a +4 bonus, better than the +2 that Shield Master gives you. And the second is that because Shield Master's defensive ability requires your reaction, you won't always be able to use it. And secondly, it only really works against damaging spells, which are the least dangerous type of spells. Armored characters are much more worried about things that will lock them down, like Hold Person, or entangle them, and so if you had a better bonus to your dexterity saves or a way to evade those with Shield Master, then it could be pretty good. Unfortunately, the combination of bugs, the fact that at base this feat is already not that exciting, and the fact that you can get a better version of this feat for almost any character that would want it with Resilient, means that Shield Master is going to be D tier. Next up, Skilled. Skilled lets you learn 3 skill proficiencies of your choice. Now, you might think that I gave Actor a pretty good rating, and Actor is just 2 skill expertises, so maybe I'll give Skilled a good score, but Actor is relatively free, because you can still increase your charisma, and Expertise is a lot better than Proficiency. Skilled, unfortunately, is a huge opportunity cost for very little benefit. If you want those skill proficiencies, you can usually get them from your background pick, from your race pick, whatever. And skill proficiencies in Baldur's Gate, outside of a few specific skills, are generally not very important, so you should only ever take this feat for flavor. From a mechanical standpoint, you're spending something very, very important and getting almost nothing in return. D tier. Spell Sniper. So Spell Sniper teaches you an attack roll based cantrip, and the available ones are Bone Chill, Eldritch Blast, Firebolt, Ray of Frost, Shocking Grasp, and Thorn Whip. Of these, generally, it's almost always going to be Eldritch Blast, though taking Ray of Frost can be pretty reasonable as well, especially on a Warlock who already has Eldritch Blast. In addition to teaching you a cantrip, it also reduces the number that you need to roll to get a critical hit when attacking with a spell by 1. And this is any spell, not just the cantrip that you learned from Spell Sniper. So you get an attack roll cantrip, and all of your spells become more likely to critically hit. There's a couple characters that can really benefit from this bonus. Obviously, spellcasters that are attacking a lot is exactly what you want for Spell Sniper. So characters like Warlocks, who are casting Eldritch Blast constantly, increased chance to critical hit with their Eldritch Blasts is really good. And for a Great Old One Warlock in particular, this can help you trigger the Fear more frequently. For a Fire Sorcerer, you can learn Eldritch Blast to get another good attacking cantrip and make your Scorching Rays more likely to critically hit. And that can be pretty powerful. For a wizard, you can do something similar. So a lot of characters that are making a lot of attack rolls with their spells can benefit from increased chance to crit, because of course, critically hitting is more damage. And that's what those characters want. The other nice thing about Spell Sniper is that the spell that you learn will use the stat for that character. So if you're a cleric and you learn Eldritch Blast with Spell Sniper, you're going to have a wisdom-based Eldritch Blast, which means you'll actually be able to hit with it. This is different from Magic Initiate, where it uses the casting stat for the class that the spell is from. So if you took Magic Initiate Warlock on a cleric, you'll have a normal charisma-based Eldritch Blast, and usually miss with your Eldritch Blast. So you should take Spell Sniper if you want it on something that's with a different stat. In general, if you were going to take Magic Initiate just for a cantrip, Spell Sniper is a better choice, because the damaging cantrips that you get are often the ones that you would want, and the increased chance to critically hit is good, the exception, of course, being Booming Blade, like we talked about. I think that this feat is quite solid on builds that are attacking a lot, and can be used with specific builds very well. So things like Fire Sorcerers, things like Great Old One Warlocks can use Spell Sniper pretty well. Is it better than the alternative feats for those characters? I think usually not. A +1 chance to critically hit is good, but in practice is a pretty small increase to your average damage on those characters. So unless you're applying other bonus effects when critically hitting, Gulaks being the major source of that, Spell Sniper will usually not increase your damage that much, but it is still a nice damage increase. Getting a cantrip is pretty good overall, and there are characters that benefit from critically hitting outside of the damage, so those can use Spell Sniper as well. I'm going to give it B tier, though I think that unlike Magic Initiate, which I put in B tier begrudgingly because Booming Blade exists, I think that Spell Sniper is a fairly high B tier because there are a bunch of builds that do actively want this feat, though usually they're going to get it after they've filled out their other more important feats. Tavern Brawler. So Tavern Brawler is probably the most discussed feat in Baldur's Gate 3, and with good reason. Tavern Brawler lets you add +1 to your Strength or Constitution. So it's a half feat, basically meaning that it comes at no cost to take it for characters that want it. And when you make an unarmed attack or throw something, you add double your Strength bonus to your chance to hit and to your damage. This is absurdly powerful. Increasing your chance to hit by that much means that most enemies you will have, you'll only miss on a natural 1. So characters with Tavern Brawler who are attacking with advantage often only miss 1 in 400 attacks. You're going to see this listed in the game as a 99% chance to hit, but it's actually even higher than 99% chance with Tavern Brawler. The reason for this is that Tavern Brawler is a house rule. It does something completely different in tabletop D&D, but Larian changed it for Baldur's Gate 3. And it breaks a normal design rule for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is the concept of bounded accuracy. Bounded accuracy is the idea that your attacks should never fall outside of a normal range of hit chances. If your attacks miss too often, the game isn't fun. If your attacks hit too often, the game isn't balanced. And Tavern Brawler means that your attacks hit way more often than the normal bounded accuracy rules would allow. So it breaks a pretty fundamental design rule of Dungeons & Dragons in a way that makes your characters ridiculously powerful. It also does so at basically no cost. The requirement for using Tavern Brawler is making unarmed attacks. Well, that's what your monks were going to be doing anyways. And because strength elixirs exist in this game, you can do so even without putting any points in strength by drinking an elixir, taking Tavern Brawler, so you give up nothing in order to get this enormous bonus. Throwing weapons are also an incredibly well-supported strategy in Baldur's Gate 3. There's a lot of thrown weapons and have strong enchantments, and characters that were going to be throwing weapons now get this enormous bonus to their attacks and damage on top of that. It's hard to overstate how good Tavern Brawler is. Characters that are using it are simply going to outscale almost anything else that you can do in Baldur's Gate 3. To put it in perspective, the amount of bonus that this gives you, a character at level 1 is usually going to be rolling a d20 plus 5 to hit with an attack. They'll have 16 in their main attribute plus 2 for their proficiency, so they're rolling a d20 plus 5. By level 12, that character will be rolling a d20 plus 10, or usually 11, with enchanted weapons, because they'll have added 2 to their proficiency bonus, have a plus 2 weapon for 4 more, and then have gone up to 20 in their main attribute. So a d20 plus 11 is a fairly typical hit roll at level 12. A character with Tavern Brawler would have a d20 plus 16, or if they have strength over 20, it can be even higher. So taking Tavern Brawler by itself is worth 10 or 11 levels of progression to your hit chance just on its own. Compared to taking an ability score improvement, the bonus that you get is like taking 5 ability score improvements at once, which of course you would normally need to be level 20 in order to get. So the numerical bonuses that you get from Tavern Brawler are wildly more than one feat normally would give you in Dungeons & Dragons, and obviously that means that it's going to go straight into S+ tier. This, of course, is the mainstay of many of the most popular and most powerful honor mode builds. It's so powerful that when I posted some house rules to make the game more fun, one of the things I said was, don't take Tavern Brawler, because missing attacks can yield you more tactical gameplay, and Tavern Brawler prevents that from happening. This feat is so powerful that it just blows pretty much everything else you can do in the game out of the water. S+ tier. Tough. Tough gives you plus 2 HP per level, so it's like you increase your constitution by 4, which means that if you take it at level 4, you'll get plus 8 HP, and by level 12, you'll have plus 24 HP. Plus 24 HP on a character isn't nothing, and there are some characters that can use this to avoid being squishy, but a purely defensive feat is always going to be a tough sell, pun intended, and this one is not even super efficient. I'm going to give it C tier because there are some characters that can want this, and 24 HP certainly isn't nothing. But most of the time this feat is better going to be avoided. You're going to want to take things that proactively improve your character's game plan rather than just make them a little more resilient to what enemies are doing. Warcaster. So Warcaster we already talked a little bit about when we were discussing Resilient. It gives you advantage on your Constitution saves to maintain concentration on a spell, so when you take damage while concentrating. And is pretty good defensively for maintaining concentration on important spells. A character losing concentration on haste is obviously very bad because it stuns something. Characters losing concentration on powerful spells can be really expensive in terms of spell slots, so you want to avoid that happening. I will say that I personally very rarely take Warcaster. I think probably the last time I took this feat was more than a year ago, because I prefer in my own play to try to avoid having my spellcasters take damage and lose concentration on spells. But if you are finding that that happens, then Warcaster is a great way to prevent the worst case scenarios from coming up in combat. In general, if your character does not have con save proficiency, Resilient is going to be a bigger bonus than Warcaster, because it can increase your con save as well as giving you proficiency in that save. But if they do have con save proficiency, then Warcaster is a great alternative. Warcaster also lets you use Shocking Grasp as an opportunity attack, which is pretty nice for a spellcaster, especially one that's taking damage a lot. Maybe you're a cleric or something like that. Obviously, casting a spell is usually going to be better for a spellcaster than making a weapon attack as an opportunity attack. So clerics can benefit from that aspect of Warcaster. You don't need to know Shocking Grasp as a spell in order to use it with Warcaster. So you can gain that benefit regardless of whether you know the cantrip or not. And that can be pretty nice as well. I'm going to give it A tier. I was a little tempted to give it B tier because genuinely I no longer take this feat at all personally, but it is a great tool if you are finding that your characters are dropping concentration on their spells. Warcaster can definitely help prevent that, and since that's the main thing that a lot of spellcasters do, making them more reliable at that is still very powerful. And finally, Weapon Master. Weapon Master increases your strength or dex by 1 and gives you proficiency with 4 weapon types of your choice. The most likely way to use this feat is if you're a rogue who wants to use, for example, the finesse-based longswords. You can increase your dexterity and gain longsword proficiency to use Lorethian's Wrath or Falara Louv if you don't have longsword proficiency naturally. But for the most part, weapon proficiencies come for free from your class or race, and any character that wants to use that type of weapon will already have proficiency in that type of weapon. Taking a whole feat for it is usually not going to be a good idea, even as a half feat. D tier for Weapon Master. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this updated look at the feats in Baldur's Gate 3, and I hope that it helps you make your characters more powerful and more fun to use. I'm gonna zoom in here and give you guys a clean screenshot for those who want it, so you can see the whole list all together. As always, of course, if you think that there is a feat that I have misplaced in this tier list, and especially if you think that there's something that I've underrated in terms of how good it is, definitely let me know in the comments. Very open to changing my mind, especially if you come up with uses for a feat that I haven't considered. Then that's always really cool, and I really appreciate people who mention those things. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed the video, then of course any comment that you leave is very appreciated, and if you hit the like button, I appreciate you taking the time to do that because it helps me out with the algorithm. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.